Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay, and we find ourselves not in a grand, echoing hall of stone, but in the dense, humid heart of a reed marsh, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers decide to have a leisurely, meandering conversation. A place so flat and vast that you could watch your own horizon get bored and wander off, which is precisely where the Sumerians, with a collective sigh that probably sounded like the first ever instance of sarcasm, decided to build the world's first civilization, a decision akin to choosing to construct a masterpiece sandcastle right at the tide line. And thus our story begins not with a bang but with a squelch, as the first Sumerian to step into this fertile mud probably thought. This is either the birthplace of gods or a terrible misunderstanding. A thought he promptly forgot, because writing hadn't been invented yet to complain about it. Let us paint, with words so slow and deliberate they could be drifting in honey, the image of their first great achievement, a temple, not to a god of war or wisdom, but likely to a deity of accounting and damp storage, a structure known as a ziggurat, which is essentially a very ambitious pile of mud bricks taking a ceremonial staircase to the sky, built from the very earth they stood upon, mixed with straw and water and the desperate hope that it wouldn't dissolve back into the landscape at the first sign of a drizzle, a towering edifice that served as the divine downtown office, the literal waiting room for the gods, because if you're a deity arriving from the heavens, you apparently need a concrete, or rather a mud brick, appointment. Imagine the scene. The air thick with the smell of baking bread, drying clay and livestock who haven't gotten the memo about ceremonial dignity, the ground underfoot a mosaic of crushed pottery and discarded clay tablets that simply read regret. And in the center, the temple complex, a walled precinct humming with the activity of priests, who are also the city's administrators, lawyers, and probably part-time baristas for the divine. Their robes likely itchy, and their expressions permanently set to burdened by celestial paperwork. Within this sacred administrative district, the temple itself rises in terrace levels, each tier a different shade of sun-baked brown, like a gigantic geological layer cake offered to the heavens, with a shrine at the very top so exclusive that most humans never saw it, a place where the god statue was dressed, fed, and entertained with daily reports on grain yields, because nothing says worship like a detailed spreadsheet of barley production. A ritual so mundane it circles back to being profoundly mystical. The walls are smooth, coated with a lime plaster that gleams painfully white under the relentless Mesopotamian sun, a beacon across the flat plain that essentially shouted to neighboring cities, "Our God's office has better air conditioning than yours," which was a lie, as air conditioning was several millennia away, but the psychological warfare of a shiny building is timeless. Inside the lower levels, the corridors are narrow and dark, lit by flickering sesame oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows of bureaucrats carrying tablets, the air cool and smelling of damp earth and incense, a scent that probably said holy, but also masked the less divine aroma of a bustling urban center just outside the walls, a sensory experience designed to separate the profane from the sacred, or at least to separate the well-funded temple economy from the tax-paying public. This is the stage, my sleepy friend, for a connection so audacious it would echo for thousands of years. The idea that these very temples, these stairways to heaven, were not just symbolic but functional landing pads and diplomatic embassies for beings who descended from the stars, a notion that makes the scholarly world collectively sip a very strong drink and the fringe history community light up like a ziggurat during a festival. And it is here, in this humid, bureaucratic, and utterly fascinating cradle of civilization, that you probably won't survive this story without at least one eyebrow permanently raised in skeptical intrigue, a price I am willing to pay for your companionship tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because false algorithmic praise is the modern equivalent of inscribing a clay tablet with a 5-star review for a god who just flooded your barley field, a gesture empty of meaning and full of petty survival instincts. And as you settle in, wherever you are in the world, whether it's the deep night or a quiet afternoon, feel free to whisper your location and the time into the comments later. A digital ritual of connection that would baffle a Sumerian priest, who would likely respond with a tablet inquiring about your city's annual wool output and whether you've seen their god, Enki, who was last seen heading toward the freshwater abyss for a conference. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, floating down these ancient, slow-moving rivers toward a revelation written not in stars, but in the meticulous, accountant's cuneiform of a people who believed the divine was a monthly tenant who required prompt payment in ritual and grain. The mainstream historical fact we must cling to, like a sailor to a reed boat in a sudden marsh storm, is the undeniable, tangible reality of the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation myth discovered on fragmented tablets in the, you guessed it, city of Eridu, which tells a story of the gods creating humans to do the farm work they found tedious, a divine labor dispute that resulted in you and me having to pay taxes. A narrative so brutally practical it feels more like a corporate merger document than a sacred text, detailing how the lesser gods rebelled against their toil, leading the wise god Enki to suggest creating a new being from clay and the flesh and blood of a slain god, to take over the manual labor, a origin story that makes humanity seem less like a cherished creation and more like a divine outsourcing solution, which, if you've ever had a job, feels painfully accurate. The quirky, fringe interpretation that dances around this fact like a temple musician who's had too much date wine suggests that this clay and flesh and blood recipe is not metaphorical but literal genetic engineering, a splicing of terrestrial hominid DNA with that of an advanced extraterrestrial race, the Anunnaki, who needed gold miners for their ailing planet's atmosphere, a theory popularized by Zecharia Sitchin, who read the Sumerian tablets not as myth but as literal journalism, interpreting their descriptions of gods coming from the heavens in fiery chariots as spaceships, their divine assemblies as board meetings, and their creation of humans as a biotech startup project, an idea that makes archaeologists weep into their trowels but sells an astonishing number of books and documentaries. Because who wouldn't prefer a sci-fi epic over a story about irrigation rights disputes among temperamental deities? The scholarly debate, meanwhile, rages in a far less cinematic but equally passionate arena, centered on the very nature of these texts. Are they pure mythology, political propaganda meant to legitimize priest-kings? Or could they contain distant, garbled memories of real, catastrophic events like the Great Flood? A debate that splits academics into camps that politely disagree in footnotes with the ferocity of rival city-states arguing over water access, with one side seeing sophisticated literature and the other seeing potential historical cores wrapped in layers of allegory. A debate that ensures tenure positions and very long, very detailed conference presentations. And as we ponder this, imagine the priest in the temple, looking up at the stardusted velvet of the Mesopotamian night, the Milky Way a spilled river of milk across the sky, and wondering if the lights moving against that fixed backdrop were his master's returning, a thought that is equal parts hope, terror, and administrative anxiety about whether the divine apartments were properly stocked with ritual bread, a joke that probably circulated among the junior priests, something like, "How many Anunnaki does it take to change a sacred lamp? 1, but only after 7 days of purification rites and a committee vote," a humor that hasn't aged a day in 5,000 years. The sheer scale of the ziggurat construction, with its millions of mud bricks, each carried by hand, speaks to an organizational mania that would make a modern project manager faint. A society so devoted to the idea of divine connection that they would spend generations piling earth toward the sky, a literal manifestation of their cosmic yearning, or perhaps a very loud signal fire to any passing deities that this city was open for business and had excellent catering, a joke that the foreman probably told to keep the laborers going, saying, "Keep stacking, lads. The gods have a terrible sense of direction and might miss the buffet." The incense in the temple wasn't just for ambience. It was an olfactory billboard advertising piety, a cloud of sweet smoke meant to carry prayers upward, a system so ingrained that the priests likely had preferred blends for different requests, like Enlil's stormy day blend for rain or Inanna's date night incense, for matters of love and war, which were often the same thing in her portfolio, a divine multitasker with a complicated love life. The statues of the gods within the inner sanctum were not just idols. They were understood to be physical vessels for the divine essence, requiring literal waking, washing, dressing, and feeding rituals, a daily routine so mundane it humanized the gods, turning them into high-maintenance housemates who occasionally unleashed plagues if their linen was scratchy, a concept that gave rise to the world's first customer service industry, dedicated to celestial satisfaction, a job where the Yelp review could literally be a flood. Imagine the god statue, sitting there in the dark, being spoon-fed porridge by a terrified junior priest, a scene that is both absurd and deeply, movingly human, an attempt to bridge the infinite gap between the mud of the earth and the dust of the stars with the simple, universal language of breakfast, a joke that writes itself. Why did the god statue cross the road? To get to the other temple's breakfast buffet, which had better honey. The sounds of the city outside the temple walls were a constant low roar of humanity, the bleating of sheep, the shouts of merchants, the rhythmic pounding of grain, a cacophony that made the temple's quiet inner chamber feel like a sensory deprivation tank, a place where the only sound was your own heartbeat and the imagined whispers of the god, a stark contrast that defined the sacred experience, making you wonder if the first meditation was invented by a Sumerian priest, trying to ignore the noise of a cart axle screaming for grease right outside the holy gate. The rivers themselves were not just sources of life, but of constant low-grade anxiety, as their flooding was unpredictable and could either deliver fertile silt or catastrophic washouts, a relationship that mirrored their feelings toward the gods, essential, bountiful, and terrifyingly capricious, a dynamic that gave rise to the world's first insurance policies, written in cuneiform, and probably the first jokes about bad weather like, "What did the flood say to the farmer?" You should have subscribed to the Premium God package. The fringe theory's insistence on genetic intervention finds a strange, poetic echo in the Sumerian king list, a tablet that details rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood, durations that mainstream history dismisses as mythological inflation but fringe theorists cite as evidence of an advanced alien species with longer lifespans intermingling with early humans, a debate that turns on how you interpret the word year, which could be a mistranslation, a metaphor, or a literal account that would require a drastic rewriting of human biology. A scholarly puzzle that is less exciting than alien overlords but far more likely involved a scribe with a shaky grasp of math and a mandate to make the past look impressively long. The temple's foundation deposits, artifacts buried under corners to consecrate the building, often included simple clay figurines of humans in postures of worship, their wide eyes forever looking up, a poignant symbol of the human condition, perpetually waiting, watching, and hopping for a sign from above, a sentiment that hasn't changed even if our methods have shifted from clay idols to smartphone notifications, a joke for the ages. The Sumerian prayer figurine and the modern scene notification on a text message are spiritually identical. Both represent a message sent into the void with no guarantee of a reply. The night sky over Sumer was phenomenally clear, a planetarium dome of staggering depth, with planets moving in their strange, retrograde dances, phenomena that the priest astronomers tracked with obsessive precision, not for navigation, but for divining the moods and messages of the gods, believing the cosmos was a literal script of divine intent, a belief system that turned astronomers into celestial psychics, reading the future in the wanderings of Jupiter like a cosmic tea leaf reading. A profession ripe for satire. My celestial omen says you will have a prosperous harvest, but also that my interpretation fee is 3 bushels of barley payable up front. The very act of writing, of pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, was itself a magical technology, a way to make words physical and permanent to speak across time, an innovation that likely began as temple accounting, so many sheep, so much grain, and evolved into literature, law, and love poetry, a journey from inventory list to epic tale that mirrors humanity's own climb from survival to seeking meaning, a transformation so profound that the first author known by name, Enheduanna, was a high priestess who wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna, blending administration, politics, and ecstatic spirituality into one job description, a multitasker who probably joked, "I manage the divine wardrobe, write the hit sacred songs, and run the city's budget. My to-do list is written in stone." The mainstream fact of the Eridu Genesis directly parallels and likely influenced the later biblical Genesis account, with its sequence of creation, divine breath, and a great flood, a connection that provides a historical anchor for the biblical stories, rooting them in the fertile soil of Mesopotamian tradition rather than a vacuum, a scholarly insight that doesn't diminish the power of the Bible but enriches it, placing it in a conversation thousands of years long about where we come from and why we're here, a conversation that started with a Sumerian scribe getting a cramp in his hand while writing about gods complaining about hard work, a joke he probably shared with his colleague. What's the difference between a god and a middle manager? The god's floods are more dramatic. The fringe interpretation takes this connection and runs with it, proposing that the biblical Elohim is a plural word for gods that directly references the Sumerian Anunnaki pantheon, and that the Garden of Eden was a Mesopotamian botanical garden, or perhaps a genetic laboratory, a theory that treats the Bible as a fragmented, edited report of ancient alien contact, a perspective that is nothing if not imaginative, and provides a unified field theory for every ancient mystery, which is intellectually convenient if not rigorously supported, a kind of historical conspiracy theory that is as enduring as it is unprovable, much like the joke about the divine council. How many Anunnaki does it take to decide a human fate? A majority, unless Enki vetoes it, then it goes to subcommittee for review. The air in the reed marshes at dusk would have been filled with insects and the calls of waterfowl, a cacophony of life that slowly quieted as the stars emerged, a daily transformation from a world of tangible, muddy labor to one of vast, silent mystery, a shift that naturally invites stories about beings from that silent vastness coming down to the noisy, wet earth, a narrative born from the human experience of day turning to night, a cycle as old as time, and a perfect setup for a joke. Why did the Anunnaki come to Earth? For the gold, obviously, but also because the nightlife in the asteroid belt was non-existent. The temple's central courtyard, where public ceremonies were held, was a stage for reenacting the myths, a place where the community collectively breathed life into the stories of gods walking among them, a participatory theater that blurred the line between past and present, human and divine, a powerful psychological tool that reinforced the social order and offered a taste of the transcendental, all while selling sacrificial animals and ritual cakes. The world's first combination of spiritual retreat and concession stand, where a priest might say, "For 3 shekels, you get a blessing and a date pastry. It's a divine combo meal." As you drift, picture the weight of a clay tablet in your hands, cool and damp, the scribe's stylus pressing the story of your very origins into its surface, a story of being fashioned from clay and divine blood to be a servant, a story that is both humbling and strangely empowering. For it places humanity in the workshop of the gods, not as an accident but as a deliberate, if labor-oriented project, a cosmic purpose that involves a lot of irrigation digging, which is a punchline waiting to happen. What did the first human say to the god Enki? You built me from divine essence and mud to be a ditch digger. My career counselor is going to hear about this. And as the first section of our long, slow story concludes, we leave the temple at twilight, its white walls glowing in the last light, a beacon not just of faith, but of a profound human desire to connect the earthly with the heavenly, to find our makers and ask them, politely and with appropriate offerings, what exactly the instruction manual said. A quest that begins here, in the mud and reeds, with a people who wrote their questions to the stars in the very earth beneath their feet. A legacy pressed into clay that we are still deciphering tonight in the quiet of your room, with the fan humming and the lights dim. A direct line of curiosity spanning 5,000 years, which is, when you think about it, the longest-running joke in human history. The search for answers that only lead to more questions. Having established the Sumerian stage, a flat, muddy canvas under an immense sky, we now zoom in, not on a king or a conqueror, but on a bureaucrat, a temple scribe whose name is lost to time but whose cramped hand and slightly cynical tone we can somehow still feel across the millennia, as he sits in a small, shadowed room lit by a single, guttering lamp, its flame making the shadows of his clay tablets dance like restless spirits, and he is composing, or perhaps just copying, the very text that will become the cornerstone of our exploration tonight. The Epic of Atrahasis, a story so foundational it makes the biblical flood narrative look like a late-edition fan fiction. A tale that begins not with, in the beginning, but with the gods were having a labor dispute, which is arguably a more relatable origin for anyone who has ever attended a staff meeting that lasted longer than the creation of the universe. This scribe, let's call him Lunana to give him some dignity, is not writing for glory. He is likely fulfilling a quota, copying a canonical text to be stored in the temple archives or perhaps sent to a regional administrator who needs a refresher on why humans are so troublesome. His stylus moving in quick, precise jabs to form wedges that tell of a time when the lesser gods, the Igigi, were forced to do all the hard labor of digging riverbeds and raising temples, work that left them exhausted and in a profoundly ancient cry of injustice, rebellious. A plot point that establishes the Sumerian worldview as one of cosmic hierarchy, grievance, and administrative solutions, a worldview where even divinity has a unionization problem. The mainstream, undeniable fact we cling to in this section is the existence and content of the Atrahasis epic itself, dated to around the 18th century BCE. A masterpiece of Mesopotamian literature that details the entire cycle. The gods' labor crisis, the creation of humans to bear this burden, humanity's subsequent overpopulation and noisiness disturbing the chief god Enlil, and his successive attempts to curb them. Plague, famine, drought, each thwarted by the clever, humanity sympathizing god Enki, culminating in Enlil's ultimate solution, the great flood from which only the righteous Atrahasis, warned by Enki, escapes on a giant boat. A story that is less about divine love and more about divine annoyance and bureaucratic subversion. A tone that is refreshingly candid about the messy mechanics of running a cosmos. The quirky, fringe interpretation of this epic, whispered in circles that enjoy connecting dots with neon lines, posits that the Igigi gods were not mythological symbols, but a class of astronaut miners stationed on Earth. Their rebellion, a literal strike against harsh working conditions in gold mines, and the creation of humans through genetic manipulation, was the corporate R&D department's solution to the labor shortage. With Enki as the rogue scientist leaking the flood plan to his favorite prototype, Atrahasis, a reading that turns the epic into a whistleblower narrative from the dawn of time, complete with corporate espionage and a giant ark built from company materials. A theory that, while making Assyriologists consider a career change, does provide a compelling reason for why the gods would need gold so badly. A commodity with limited practical use to a Bronze Age society but theoretically useful for advanced technology, like coding electrical components, which is a joke the Ijigi probably told. How many Anunnaki does it take to change a fuse? None. They're still waiting for the humans to mine enough gold to make a new one. The scholarly debate here is a rich tapestry of translation and context, focusing particularly on the term used for the noise of humanity that so angered Enlil, often translated as clamor or din, with some academics arguing it represents social disorder and moral decay, while others see it as a metaphor for ecological overreach, humanity's unchecked growth throwing the natural world into chaos, a debate that mirrors modern concerns about population and sustainability, proving that some anxieties are truly timeless, and that ancient scribes were already worrying about their neighbors being too loud, a universal complaint that spawned the first noise ordinance, divinely decreed. Imagine Lunana's world as he writes. The air is still and hot, thick with the smell of wet clay, lamp smoke, and his own mild sweat. Outside, the city of Sippar, where this version of the epic was found, is winding down for the night, the sounds of the day fading into the chirp of crickets and the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Euphrates against its banks, a sound that must have been the constant soundtrack to life, a reminder of both sustenance and potential annihilation, a duality that the Atrahasis epic captures perfectly, making it not just a story but an environmental and social commentary written in wedge-shaped code. The tablet in his hands is not a pristine artifact. It has small imperfections, a thumbprint smudging one edge, a place where the clay was too dry and the stylus skipped, leaving a ragged line, these human errors making the text more authentic, more alive, as if we can hear Lunana sigh as he has to start the line over, muttering a curse under his breath that would likely invoke the very God he's writing about, a meta moment of frustration shared across time, a joke about writer's block that is literally written in stone. The God of scribes is testing me today. My stylus is as dull as Enlil's patience. The story he records is brutally logical in its structure. The gods have a problem, they engineer a solution, humans. The solution creates new problems, overpopulation. Management tries to correct it, calamities. A sympathetic middle manager undermines the corrections, Enki, forcing a hard reset, the flood. A cycle that any modern systems analyst would recognize as a failed project management flowchart, complete with stakeholder conflict and poor communication protocols. A divine comedy of errors that ends with a massive Earth covering Control plus Z. The fringe theory's focus on gold finds a curious anchor in the archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia, where gold was indeed highly prized but relatively rare, used primarily for elite ornaments and cultic objects, not for practical tools, which to the fringe suggests its value was not intrinsic but imposed by the gods for their own off-world purposes, a circular argument that is as shiny and seductive as the metal itself, and just as heavy. A notion that mainstream archaeology dismisses by pointing to the universal human attraction to shiny, non-corroding metals, a tendency seen in cultures worldwide with no need for alien intervention, a simpler explanation that lacks galactic drama but has the weight of common sense, a scholarly tug-of-war that is its own kind of entertainment, like watching two priests debate the correct way to polish a divine scepter. Enki's role as the benefactor of humanity, the trickster god who subverts Enlil's genocidal decrees, establishes an archetype that will echo through mythology forever. The Prometheus figure, the compassionate rebel within the divine bureaucracy, a character that speaks to a deep human hope that somewhere in the halls of power, there is someone on our side, a hope that is both comforting and a little pathetic, like believing the IT department will actually prioritize your ticket. A joke as old as civilization. Why did Enki cross the cosmic void? To give humans the secret of life, and also to annoy his brother Enlil, which was a bonus. The description of human creation in Atrahasis is visceral and strangely technical. The mother goddess Mami mixes clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, Wheela, who was chosen precisely for his intelligence, a recipe that imbues humanity with both a physical substance and a divine, conscious spirit. A ghost, as the text calls it, a formulation that blurs the line between biological engineering and spiritual infusion, a process that sounds less like magic and more like a lab procedure, complete with a specific ingredient list and a sacrificed donor. A detail that fringe theorists pounce on as evidence of a gene-splicing operation, while mainstream scholars see a powerful metaphor for the human condition. Part earth, part heaven, mortal yet aware of the divine, a beautiful paradox pressed into clay. The flood narrative itself in Atrahasis is shockingly practical. Enki doesn't appear to Atrahasis in a dream. He speaks to him through a reed wall, giving him precise, technical instructions to build a circular, roofed coracle coated in bitumen, dimensions specified. A vessel designed for buoyancy, not ocean voyages. A detail that suggests a deep familiarity with Mesopotamian boat-building techniques for river floods. A local solution to a local problem mythologized into a global cataclysm. A process of exaggeration that is the very engine of epic storytelling, and a source of endless jokes among boatmakers. What's the difference between Atrahasis' ark and a standard river barge? About 600 cubits of divine instruction, and a much better story for the grandkids. After the flood waters subside, the story takes a turn that is almost comically bleak. Atrahasis offers a sacrifice, the gods, who have been starving because there were no humans left to feed them, swarm the smell like flies. A simile that is deliberately undignified, highlighting their dependence on their creation. A moment of profound irony where the masters are reduced to desperate scavengers by their own weapon of mass destruction. A plot twist that underscores the interdependence of God and human in Sumerian thought. A relationship of mutual need wrapped in layers of fear and obligation, a dynamic perfectly captured in a joke a Sumerian might tell. How do you know a god is hungry? They start agreeing with Enki. The scholarly debate often centers on the purpose of this epic. Was it primarily a theological explanation for human suffering and divine caprice, a political tool to justify social hierarchy, the king as the divinely appointed manager of the human workforce, or an ideological myth explaining natural disasters, a debate that splits along disciplinary lines, with literary scholars, historians, and anthropologists each claiming the central lens, a polite academic battle that is fought in footnotes and conference coffee breaks. A world away from the fringes interstellar war, but no less passionately argued, a testament to the story's enduring power to provoke thought, which is, in the end, what any good story should do, even if it's written by a scribe with a sore wrist. Imagine the weight of that clay tablet once it was finished, dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, becoming a permanent record of a world that could end. A manual for survival in a universe ruled by irritable, short-sighted bosses. A document that was both sacred and utterly practical, filed away in a library for a future generation that might need the blueprint for the Ark, or at least the reassurance that someone had survived this before. A function of mythology that is often overlooked. It is a technology for transmitting hope across generations, a kind of psychological software update, a concept that would make Lunana snort and say, "It's just my job, but if it helps you sleep at night during flood season, you're welcome." The fringe interpretation's insistence on the flood as a real, global event caused by celestial interference, perhaps the melting of ice caps from a near pass of Nibiru, the supposed 12th planet, is a house of cards built on selective reading and astronomical speculation. But it taps into a universal human fascination with cataclysm and hidden truth, a narrative that is more satisfying than the slower, messier realities of geological change and localized river flooding. A desire for a clean, dramatic explanation that we see repeated in every culture's flood myths, a collective memory perhaps of rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, a natural event dramatic enough to be carved into the DNA of human storytelling, a process that needs no aliens, just a lot of water and very scared survivors who probably joked, "What's the first thing you rebuild after a flood?" A tavern, because you're going to need a drink to tell this story. The character of Atrahasis himself, whose name means exceedingly wise, is not a king or a warrior but an ordinary, pious man, a template for Noah that emphasizes wisdom and obedience to the right God Enki as the keys to survival, a moral that is less about brute force and more about listening to the right insider information, a very Mesopotamian virtue that valued cleverness and divine connections over sheer power, a survival guide for a precarious world, and the subject of many a parental lecture. Listen to your elders, son, or you'll end up on the wrong side of a divine flood like everyone who ignored Atrahasis. As you drift deeper, picture the circular ark, bobbing on the endless waters, a tiny, sealed world containing the seeds of all life, a metaphor for the isolation and responsibility of carrying culture through disaster, an image so powerful it has never left us, and wonder if the Sumerians saw their own ziggurats as arks, permanent arcs of mud brick meant to ride out the metaphorical floods of political and social chaos, a hope built layer by layer against the fear of total dissolution. A joke the architects might have shared. They say my ziggurat is crooked. I say it's just designed to better ride the waves of divine displeasure. The epic ends not with a rainbow covenant, but with a bleak compromise. Enki and the mother goddess introduce new measures to control human population, infertility, infant mortality, and a class of celibate priestesses. A chillingly pragmatic solution to the noise problem, a conclusion that is brutally frank about the costs of cosmic order, a far cry from a happy ending, but perhaps a more honest one, acknowledging that survival comes with limits and conditions, a lesson that feels uncomfortably relevant, and a punchline only a Mesopotamian could love. What did the gods give humanity to celebrate survival? Higher child mortality and mandatory celibacy for some. Enjoy your brave new world. And so, as Lunana sets down his stylus, rolls his stiff shoulders and blows out the lamp, plunging his little room into a darkness relieved only by the starlight coming through a high window, he has inscribed a chain of ideas that will snake through history, connecting his world of gods and floods to a desert tribe's genesis, and ultimately to our own wondering questions about origin and purpose, a chain whose first links are forged here, in the pragmatic, unsentimental, yet deeply imaginative mind of a Sumerian scribe who was probably just glad his shift was over, a feeling we can all relate to as we continue our own shift of exploration tonight, carried on the gentle, rolling waves of narrative toward the next discovery, which involves kings, divine right, and the possibility that some of those kings might not have been entirely human, a claim that makes the fringe theorists sit up straight and the mainstream historians reach for a very large textbook to throw. Metaphorically speaking, a conflict that is itself a kind of divine comedy for the ages. From the damp, lamplit scriptorium of a scribe, we now ascend, not to the heavens just yet, but to the summit of worldly power, to the palace of a Sumerian king, a man who is not merely a ruler but a bridge, a literal connection point between the bustling, noisy human city below and the silent, watchful gods above, a figure whose very job description is to be a divine antenna, and this brings us to the bedrock mainstream fact of this section. The concept of sacred marriage, or the hieros gamos, a central ritual in Sumerian religion where the king, representing the god Dumuzi, would engage in ritual intercourse with the high priestess, representing the goddess Inanna, to ensure the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the people, and the renewal of the divine mandate to rule. A ceremony that was as politically crucial as it was religiously profound, blending sex, sovereignty, and agriculture into one powerful, public performance of cosmic connectivity. Imagine the scene in the city of Uruk, perhaps, at the New Year festival. The ziggurat is festooned with garlands and banners, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and myrrh. The population, from the highest official to the lowest laborer, is caught in a frenzy of processions, music, and controlled revelry, all building toward the climactic moment when the king and the priestess, shrouded in layers of symbolic costume and palpable anticipation, would disappear into the sacred bedchamber, a room likely positioned at the very apex of the temple complex, a terrestrial echo of the celestial boudoir, to enact a union that was believed to literally revitalize the world. A pressure that would give any modern performer stage fright of cosmic proportions, a joke the royal guards probably told. What's the king's pre-ritual mantra? Please let this work, please let the crops grow, please don't let me sneeze. The quirky, fringe interpretation of this ritual, however, takes this symbolic act and runs with it into territory that would make a Sumerian priest blush, proposing that the sacred marriage was not symbolic at all but a literal genetic program, a controlled breeding initiative supervised by the Anunnaki to produce hybrid offspring, a royal bloodline that carried distinct, divine DNA, granting extended lifespans, heightened intelligence, and the right to rule. A theory that points to the Sumerian king list and its preposterously long reigns as evidence of this hybridization, suggesting that the earliest kings were not metaphoric, sons of gods, but literal hybrids, whose diluted genetics in later generations led to shorter reigns and more human-like lifespans, a narrative that turns the royal palace into a laboratory and the king into a designed specimen, an idea that is equal parts sci-fi thriller and cynical take on the divine right of kings, and a rich source of jokes about royal inbreeding that are, sadly, not unique to fringe theory. The scholarly debate surrounding the Hieros Gamos is less about aliens and more about intensity and interpretation. Was the ritual actual sexual intercourse, or was it a symbolic, dramatic performance? Did it involve the real king and a real priestess, or were they stand-ins? The evidence is fragmentary and poetic, leaning toward a real enactment, but the debate rages with the kind of polite fervor reserved for topics involving ancient sexuality and power dynamics, with some scholars seeing it as the core of Mesopotamian kingship ideology, and others viewing it as one of many rituals in a vast ceremonial calendar. A debate that is complicated by our own modern sensitivities and the fragmentary nature of the hymns that describe it. Like trying to reconstruct a R-rated movie from a few scattered lines of poetic subtitles. Now let's inhabit the king's perspective on this, his day of days. He has been purified through days of rituals, washed in sacred water, fed on specific foods, dressed in robes that weigh as much as a small child, laden with lapis lazuli and gold, symbols of the starry heavens and the sun, his head crowned not with a simple diadem but with the literal horns of divinity, a costume that proclaims, I am no longer just me. I am the vessel for Dumuzi, the shepherd god, the lover of Inanna, a psychological transformation that must have been as exhausting as it was exhilarating, a out-of-body experience mandated by the state, a job perk that includes temporary deification and immense performance anxiety, a combination that would make anyone want a strong drink, but which was probably forbidden by ritual protocol, leading to the first recorded instance of I need a vacation from being a god. The high priestess, often the king's own daughter or a woman of highest elite status, undergoes her own transformation into Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and political power, a deity of terrifying complexity and appetite, a role that grants her immense temporary authority in a profoundly patriarchal society, a moment of inverted power that must have been thrilling and fraught, as she prepares to become the conduit for the goddess's life force. To channel the creative and destructive energies of the cosmos into the body politic through the king, a responsibility that makes modern public speaking look like child's play and a subject for a joke among the temple attendants. What does the high priestess want for the ceremony? Absolute silence, perfect attendance, and for someone to fix the squeaky bed in the sacred chamber, because nothing kills divine ambience like a rusty spring. The ritual itself, described in tantalizing fragments in hymns like the Love Song of Shu-Sin, is rich with earthy, passionate imagery, a dialogue between the two deities as embodied by the humans, speaking of desire, fertility, and the joyous union that makes the fields green and the herds multiply, a poetry that is both sensuous and deeply functional, a magic spell cast with the body to guarantee the continuation of civilization itself. A level of stakes that turns intimacy into a high-pressure public service, a concept ripe for satire. The king's two jobs, administer justice and perform divine coitus for good harvests, talk about a diverse portfolio. The fringe theory's genetic interpretation finds a curious, if twisted, anchor in the pervasive Sumerian iconography of half-human, half-animal beings, like the Apkallu sages or the heroes depicted on cylinder seals, often shown in interaction with gods or the tree of life, figures that mainstream archaeology interprets as mythological guardians or symbolic representations, but that fringe theorists see as depictions of the literal hybrid offspring of the Anunnaki-human union. A permanent record of the genetic experimentation that produced the semi-divine kings of old, a reading that turns museum artifacts into family portraits of a hybrid species, a claim that is as audacious as it is impossible to disprove definitively, which is both its strength and its greatest weakness, an intellectual gambit that is the equivalent of saying all modern politicians are lizards. It's unfalsifiable and therefore endlessly entertaining, a joke the ancients might have appreciated. Why did the hybrid king cross the road? To get to the other gene pool, which was unfortunately closed for purification rites. After the ceremony, the king would emerge, presumably, to public acclaim and relief, his divinity now confirmed, and the fertility of the land secured for another year. His rule legitimized not just by force of arms or administrative skill, but by this direct, physical connection to the divine source of life, a political technology of breathtaking efficiency, making rebellion not just treason but sacrilege against the very forces that made the barley grow. A system that kept people in line with a combination of hope, fear, and the promise of a good harvest, a social contract written in ritual, seed, and royal sweat, a contract that probably had fine print no one read about poor harvests leading to royal replacement, a clause enforced by the same priests who organized the ceremony, a circular system of power that is the true magic of the ritual. The scholarly debate often extends to the aftermath. What was the status of any child born from this union? Was there a special, semi-divine status for such a potential offspring? The records are silent, suggesting either that no child was expected or that the ritual was symbolic, but the question lingers, feeding speculation and, of course, fringe theories about dynasties of hybrid rulers, a tantalizing, what if? That adds a layer of Gothic mystery to the dry archaeological record, a mystery that will never be solved but will always be pondered, like wondering if the sacred bed had good pillows, a question for the ages. The king's daily life, outside this annual peak, was saturated with smaller rituals meant to maintain this connection. Morning prayers, divination sessions, presiding over sacrifices, all acts that reinforced his role as the chief communicator with the gods, the CEO who also heads the spiritual department, a job that left little time for leisure, unless you count reviewing omens from sheep livers as leisure, a hobby that is an acquired taste, to say the least, and a source of endless bureaucratic humor. What did the sheep's liver say to the king? Your investment in northern irrigation is divinely questionable, but the omens for your wife's new hairstyle are surprisingly positive. The fringe theory's insistence on a literal divine bloodline inevitably crashes into the hard wall of the Mesopotamian historical record, which shows kings dying of disease, assassination, and old age like everyone else, their reigns getting progressively shorter and more human, a trend that the fringe explains as genetic dilution, while mainstream history sees it as the slow demystification of kingship and the improvement of chronological record-keeping, a classic clash between a dramatic, overarching narrative and the messy, incremental progress of actual history. A clash where the simpler explanation is usually the winner, but the dramatic one is the one that gets the theme music in a documentary, a fact not lost on anyone trying to tell a good story, ancient or modern. As night deepens in your own room, Imagine the weight of that crown-horned headdress, the scratch of the ritual robe, the smell of incense so thick it's like breathing perfume. The eyes of the entire city, metaphorically, upon that sealed chamber door, waiting for a sign that the world had been remade, a collective holding of breath that is a powerful form of social glue, a moment where story, belief, and survival are fused into a single, dramatic act. A technology of social cohesion more complex than any law code, and a reminder that the connection between Genesis and divine arrival wasn't just a story for the Sumerians. It was an annual event, a recharge of the cosmic battery performed by their highest officials, a civic duty of the most intimate kind, a concept that makes modern tax paying seem almost dignified by comparison, a joke that writes itself. What's the difference between a Sumerian king and a modern politician? One performs a sacred sexual ritual to ensure prosperity. The other just promises to lower taxes, which is arguably less effective. The hymns sung during the festival for Inanna and Dumuzi are some of the most beautiful and emotionally complex poetry to survive from antiquity, full of longing, joy, and the inevitable sorrow of separation, as Dumuzi must later descend to the underworld. A cycle that mirrors the agricultural year and the human experience of love and loss, a sophistication that belies the simplistic fertility cult label often attached to such rituals, revealing a civilization capable of profound abstraction and emotional depth, using the metaphor of divine romance to explain the very rhythms of life and death, a poetry that was probably enjoyed by the common people even if they didn't get the front-row seats to the main event, a cultural touchstone that gave meaning to their toil, and maybe a few risque jokes for the tavern afterward. What did Inanna say to Dumuzi after the sacred marriage? "That was heavenly, darling. Now go check on the sheep, I have a war to plan." The practical political benefits of this ritual for the ruling house cannot be overstated. It effectively monopolized the connection to the divine, making the king's family the indispensable link between the people and their sustenance, a brilliant piece of ideological engineering that justified inequality and centralized power, a system so effective it would be copied, adapted, and refined for millennia in the concept of the divine right of kings, a legacy that starts here, in the mud-brick temples of Sumer, with a king pretending or believing he was a god for a night. A performance that shaped history and a premise for a comedy of errors. The king's worst nightmare, getting a divine cramp at the crucial moment and having to explain it to the high priestess, and by extension, the entire pantheon. The archaeological evidence for the sacred marriage is indirect but persuasive. Texts like the love songs, administrative records of massive food distributions for the New Year festival, and the very architecture of temples with their raised, secluded chambers, all point to a ceremony of immense public importance, a fact that anchors the ritual in historical reality, even as its intimate details float in the realm of scholarly interpretation and fringe speculation, a balance between hard evidence and eternal mystery that is the sweet spot for any good historical tale. A place where we can know something happened, but we can never quite know how it felt. A gap that imagination, both ancient and modern, rushes to fill, sometimes with poetry, sometimes with alien DNA. And as we leave the king in his moment of both triumph and exhaustion, the fate of the kingdom metaphorically resting on his shoulders, we turn our gaze upward, for the Sumerians did not believe the gods resided solely in the temple statues or in the body of the king during the ritual. They believed their gods lived in the heavens, in specific, identifiable locations among the stars, and that they traveled back and forth in celestial boats, a belief that brings us to the next link in our chain. The cosmos as a map of divine movement, a literal highway for the gods' arrival, a concept that will launch us from the earthly bedchamber into the starry void, a transition that is both a relief and an escalation, like going from a very intense drama to a full-blown science fiction epic. But for the Sumerians, it was all part of the same, continuous story, a story where the bedroom and the cosmos were just different rooms in the same divine palace, a palace with a very complicated commute. From the charged, intimate space of the sacred bedchamber, we now throw open the ceilings, both of the temple and of our imagination, to gaze upward into the vast, dark velvet of the Mesopotamian night. A dome so clear and unpolluted by light that the stars did not twinkle so much as burn with a cold, steady insistence. And here we encounter the next mainstream, incontrovertible fact. The Sumerians and their Babylonian successors were meticulous, obsessive astronomers who mapped the heavens, identified constellations, tracked the movements of planets, and developed a complex celestial omen system where every event in the sky was a word in a divine sentence about earthly affairs, believing that the gods, the Anunnaki, literally resided in or traveled through specific heavenly bodies, with the planet Jupiter representing the chief god Marduk, or earlier, Enlil, Venus the goddess Inanna/Ishtar, and so on, a cosmology that turned the night sky into a dynamic, readable score of divine activity and intention, a literal scripture written in points of light. Imagine the temple rooftop, a flat, plastered platform at the top of the ziggurat, accessed by a narrow staircase that only the initiated could climb, where a priest astronomer, let's call him Enlilaha, stands in the cool, pre-dawn air, his eyes adapted to the darkness, a clay tablet and a sharpened reed stylus in his hands, ready to record the precise position of the rising of the star Sothis or the ominous proximity of Mars to the constellation of the Scorpion. His breath making small plumes in the chill, his entire being focused on translating the silent movements above into a forecast for the king about war, harvest, or royal health, a job that combined the skills of a mathematician, a meteorologist, and a psychic, with the penalty for error being not a bad performance review but potentially the wrath of both the king and the god he misread. A high-stakes gig that probably came with terrible sleep schedule and excellent benefits in the form of temple food. A joke among the astrologers. What's an astronomer's favorite meal? Leftover stargazing stew, served cold at midnight because that's when the good omens appear. The quirky, fringe interpretation of this sophisticated astronomy is, predictably, that it wasn't just for omens or calendar keeping, but was actually a form of navigational and scheduling data for the Anunnaki spacecraft, with the constellations serving as celestial beacons and the planetary movements calculating launch windows for travel between Earth and their home planet, Nibiru, a hidden world on a long, elliptical orbit. With the Sumerian astronomical tablets being not primitive astrology, but advanced, coded flight manuals, a theory that points to the astonishing accuracy of some of their astronomical cycles, like the Saros cycle for predicting eclipses, as evidence of knowledge handed down by a superior intelligence. Because how else could a Bronze Age people predict eclipses without understanding orbital mechanics? A rhetorical question that ignores the painstaking centuries of empirical observation that actually explains it, but which makes for a much more exciting story involving interstellar travel agents, a concept that spawns jokes like, why did the Anunnaki pilot get lost? He relied on Babylonian star charts, but someone had moved Orion's belt as a prank. The scholarly debate in this arena is fierce and nuanced, centering on the purpose and origin of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. Was it fundamentally driven by religious divinatory needs, as the omen texts suggest, or did it develop an independent, scientific momentum over time? Furthermore, how much of their advanced knowledge, such as the precession of the equinoxes, was truly understood versus empirically observed and recorded in a pragmatic, ritual context? This debate sees some scholars painting the Mesopotamians as proto-scientists and others as ritual specialists who happen to generate scientific data, a distinction that matters deeply in the history of science but would likely bore Enlilaha to tears, as his primary concern was whether the king would be pleased with the morning's report, not his posthumous classification as a scientist or a priest, a dichotomy that is modern, not ancient, and a source of humor for the ages. What did the astronomer priest say to the philosopher? Your theories about the nature of the heavens are fascinating, but can they tell me if it's going to rain on the King's Parade next Tuesday? The sky they observed was not the random scatter we often perceive. It was a highly structured landscape, divided into three paths. The path of Anu, the equator, the path of Enlil, the northern sky, and the path of E, the southern sky, each the domain of specific gods with the planets, the wild sheep or wanderers, moving through these paths as divine messengers or the gods themselves on walkabout, a system that imposed a celestial bureaucracy on the chaos of the cosmos, mirroring the earthly social structure, because if heaven is not orderly, how can earth be? A comforting notion that turns anxiety about the unknown into a manageable chart, a cosmic organizational scheme that is the ultimate expression of the Sumerian desire for lists and order, a joke for the clerks. Why did the planet Venus go to the path of Anu? To file a complaint about Mars loitering in its assigned constellation, standard celestial paperwork. The fringe theory's linchpin, the planet Nibiru, is a ghost in the astronomical machine, a world supposedly known to the Sumerians but lost to modern science, described in cuneiform texts as a crossing planet associated with Marduk, which fringe theorists interpret as a large, rogue planet with a 3,600-year orbit that periodically swings through the inner solar system, causing cataclysms on Earth, like the Flood, and serving as the home base of the Anunnaki. A claim that mainstream astronomy dismisses utterly, pointing out that no such planet exists in the observed solar system, and that the cuneiform references are either mythological or refer to Jupiter. A debate that is fundamentally asymmetrical, with one side citing ancient texts and the other citing the entire body of modern astrophysics. A conversation that is less a debate and more a dialogue between two different universes of discourse, one literalist and imaginative, the other empirical and skeptical, a clash that generates more heat than light, much like a poorly predicted eclipse. And Enlil's tools were simple but effective. His eyes, a viewing rod perhaps, a clepsydra water clock for timing events, and a mind trained on memorizing precise patterns, his life's work contributing to tables of data that would span generations, a long-term project aimed at discerning the predictable rhythms within the apparent chaos, a search for order that is the very heart of science, even if its stated goal was divination. A reminder that the quest to understand the universe often begins with the practical need to not be blindsided by it, a motivation as true today as it was then, though our tools are fancier and our omens are called climate models, a joke about progress. What's the difference between a Babylonian omen tablet and a modern supercomputer? About 5,000 years and several $billion, but both are trying to answer the same question. What's going to happen to the harvest? The constellation they recognized are ancestors of our own. Orion was the true shepherd of Anu, Gemini were the great twins, Leo was the great dog. But they also saw shapes we've forgotten, like the wagon, part of our Draco, or the scorpion's heart, Antares, a celestial map that was also a storybook of their myths, where the drama of Inanna's descent to the underworld or Marduk's battle with Tiamat was played out in the seasonal rise and set of stars, a narrative written in light, making the sky a nightly reinforcement of their cultural and religious identity, a public broadcast of their foundational stories, free of charge, if you knew how to read it, a skill that was the exclusive property of the temple, the original subscription service, with jokes about bad interpreters. What did the novice astronomer say when he saw a meteor? The gods are throwing their discarded clay tablets at us. The high priest replied, no, that's just a bad omen for the pottery district. The idea of divine travel on celestial boats is pervasive in the texts, describing the gods sailing across the heavens, or between heaven and earth in magnificent vessels called barks, that shone with the brilliance of metals and gems, a poetic image that fringe theorists literalize as descriptions of spacecraft or shuttle craft, their glowing entry into the atmosphere seen as a boat of fire sailing the sky, an interpretation that strips the poetry for a nuts and bolts reading. which might please an engineer but would sadden a poet, and probably the original scribe, who was likely going for awe, not technical specifications, a tension as old as interpretation itself, and a punchline. How do you know a Sumerian text is about a spaceship? It says boat and shines like the sun, which to a literalist clearly means titanium alloy and plasma thrusters, not, a metaphor. The scholarly world is captivated by the mathematical achievements embedded in these astronomical texts, particularly the later Babylonian Goal Year, texts which used complex periodicities to predict planetary positions and eclipses with remarkable accuracy, a system built on relentless data collection over centuries, a monument to human patience and intellect that required no alien tutors, just generations of unsung Enlilahas squinting at the stars and writing it down. A collaborative project across time that is, in its own way, more impressive than receiving knowledge from star travelers, because it represents humanity lifting itself by its own intellectual bootstraps, a slow, hard climb to understanding, a process that is less cinematic but more genuinely heroic, and a source of dry humor. What did one generation of astronomers say to the next? Here are the tablets, don't screw up the data, and for Enlil's sake, try to keep the water clock from freezing in winter. The fringe theory's reliance on the accuracy of Sumerian astronomy as proof of external help misunderstands the nature of that accuracy, which was empirical and cyclical, not theoretical. They knew when things would happen by pattern recognition, not why they happened through gravitational physics, a distinction that is crucial, like knowing the bus schedule without understanding internal combustion, a knowledge that is immensely useful but not proof of having met the bus manufacturer, a point often lost in the excitement, leading to jokes among scientists. What did the Sumerian astronomer say to the alien? Thank you for the eclipse tables, but could you also explain gravity? No. Just the schedule, well, it's a start. As you lie there, perhaps you can almost feel the cool night air of that rooftop, hear the distant, muffled sounds of the sleeping city below, and see the overwhelming sprawl of the Milky Way, a sight that few modern humans ever witness in its full glory, a spectacle that demands stories, that begs for explanation, that invites the mind to populate the darkness with beings and meanings, an invitation the Sumerians accepted with gusto. Creating a cosmos alive with divine personalities traveling on predictable but watchable routes, a universe that was both intimately connected to their daily lives and awesomely vast, a balance that is psychologically sophisticated, allowing for both agency and awe, a mindset that is hard to recapture but worth the attempt, and a setup for a sleepy joke. Why did the Sumerian look at the stars? To know if he should plant barley, to feel connected to the gods, and to have something to talk about at the water channel that wasn't just irrigation disputes. The planets were the real actors in this drama, their retrograde motions, the apparent backward loops they make in the sky, posing a particular challenge and source of ominous meaning, seen as the gods standing still to observe or turning back their gaze, moments of heightened divine attention that required extra ritual care, an interpretation that turned a tricky optical illusion into a celestial spotlight on human affairs, a form of cosmic theater where humanity was always on stage. A feeling that can be either terrifying or validating, depending on your standing with the priests, and a rich source of astrological humor. My planet is in retrograde. What does that mean? It means the god Marduk is looking over his shoulder at my financial decisions, and he does not approve, so I'm going to need a loan from the temple. The legacy of this celestial mapping is all around us. Our 60-minute hour, 360-degree circle, and the division of the zodiac into 12 signs are all gifts from Mesopotamian astronomy. Adapted and transmitted through Greek and Islamic science, a continuous thread of human observation that connects your wristwatch to Enlilah's water clock, a tangible link across time that requires no aliens, just the universal human need to measure and predict, a need so fundamental it shaped our very conception of time and space, an achievement that is humbling and beautiful, and the basis for a clockmaker's joke. Why is the hour 60 minutes? Because the Sumerians liked base 60, and trying to change it now would be a bigger headache than explaining retrograde motion to a skeptical king. And so, as the first hints of dawn begin to bleach the eastern stars from the sky, and Enlil packs up his tablets, his work done for the night, we have followed the Sumerian connection from the earth, to the temple, to the king's body, and now to the stars themselves, a vertical axis of belief that linked every level of existence into a coherent whole. But this axis had a destination, a purpose, a reason for being. It was a system designed for contact, for arrival, for the moment when the divine boats would actually descend. And that expectation, that lived reality of awaiting the gods, brings us to the most tangible and most debated artifacts of all. The physical descriptions of the gods themselves and their vehicles, descriptions that walk a razor's edge between the poetic, the symbolic, and the startlingly literal, a edge we will tread carefully in the next section, where we examine what the Sumerians said their gods looked like, what they wore, what they rode in, and why those descriptions have fueled imaginations and arguments for centuries, a journey from the star chart to the blueprint, from the omen to the object. A transition that promises to be either profoundly illuminating or delightfully absurd, depending on your point of view, and a perfect point to pause, take a deep breath of modern, non-ritualized air, and appreciate that no matter how advanced our science, the night sky still holds the same wonder it did for Enlil, a wonder that is, itself, a kind of divine connection, no spacecraft required. Having charted the heavens and the rituals designed to attract their inhabitants, we now come to the most tantalizing, most visually rich, and most hotly contested layer of our Sumerian exploration. The physical depictions and descriptions of the gods themselves, the very iconography that gave form to the formless and face to the faceless. And here our bedrock mainstream fact is the stunning and consistent artistic canon of Mesopotamian divinity, preserved on cylinder seals, temple reliefs and statues, which portrays the gods as anthropomorphic beings, human in shape but distinct in size, attire and accompanying symbols, often shown wearing horned crowns, the number of horns denoting rank. Carrying specific tools like the rod-ending symbol of justice and measure, and associated with fantastical hybrid creatures like lions with eagle wings or bulls with human heads, a visual language that communicated power, domain, and presence across centuries and city-states. Imagine the workshop of a seal cutter, a small space littered with fragments of lapis lazuli, hematite, and shell. The artisan, his eyes strained from minute detail work, is engraving a scene onto a cylindrical piece of stone that, when rolled across wet clay, will produce a repeating image, perhaps for a temple administrator to seal a storage jar of holy barley. And the scene he chooses from a repertoire of standardized motifs shows a deity larger than the mortals present, sitting on a throne shaped like a ziggurat, receiving offerings, or standing atop a mountain, flanked by two bearded bulls that represent thunderstorms, a tiny masterpiece of symbolic communication that will be impressed 1,000 times, a mass-produced image of the divine order, a bureaucratic tool that also happens to be a theological statement, a combination that is very Sumerian and a source of artisan humor. What did the seal cutter say when he messed up Enki's flowing waters? Well, that's a divine spill. Hopefully the priest has a sense of humor and a low standard for omens. The quirky, fringe interpretation of this iconography is, as you might guess, supremely literal. The horned helmets are not symbolic headdresses but actual helmets with antennae or communication devices. The rod-ending are not symbols of kingship but technological tools, perhaps a gene-measuring device or a power source. The hybrid creatures are not mythological symbols but representations of genetic experiments or even biorobotic guardians. And most notably, the gods' frequent mode of transport, the boat of heaven or the chariot of the gods, is a detailed if stylized depiction of a spacecraft or aircraft, with flames, wings, and radiating lines representing propulsion or energy fields, a reading that turns every museum artifact into a page from a technical manual, a perspective that delights in the mist or cloud that often surrounds these divine figures, interpreting it as the exhaust or distortion field of a vehicle. A theory that makes museum tour a lot more exciting and curators a lot more weary, spawning jokes like, why did the Anunnaki wear horned helmets? For better cellular reception across dimensions, obviously, and because it was a fierce look for the annual Celestial Review. The scholarly debate in this arena is less about aliens and more about semiotics and syncretism. What did each symbol mean to the contemporary viewer? How did the iconography change as gods rose and fell in prominence, Marduk, absorbing the attributes of earlier gods? How much was borrowed from neighboring cultures, and how much was indigenous invention? This debate involves careful analysis of artifact context, inscription pairing, and the evolution of motifs over time, a painstaking detective work that reconstructs a visual theology, a system where every curl of a beard and every point on a crown carried specific meaning, a code that we have only partially cracked, leaving room for speculation, and of course, for dramatic misinterpretation, a field where a misplaced horn can lead to a scholarly paper and a fringe theory book. A difference of about one peer review panel. Let's examine a classic scene, a cylinder seal impression showing a god, often identified as Shamash the sun god, emerging from between two mountain peaks, holding a saw-toothed blade with rays emanating from his shoulders, an image that mainstream scholarship interprets as a representation of the sun rising at dawn, cutting through the darkness, with the mountains being the eastern horizon and the rays symbolizing sunlight, a beautiful, poetic metaphor in stone. The fringe interpretation, however, sees a pilot exiting a spacecraft that has landed in a mountain range, holding a tool or weapon, with energy beams or thrusters firing from the craft's propulsion units, a reading that replaces poetry with piloting, a trade-off that some find more satisfying in its concreteness. A classic case of seeing is believing, but forgetting that what we see is filtered through 5,000 years of cultural and artistic convention. A filter that is itself the subject of study, not an obstacle to be bulldozed by literalism, a point that leads to jokes about artistic license. What did the Sumerian artist say to the Anunnaki pilot? Sir, for the seal impression, could you pose with the rod end ring? The holding a wrench look doesn't convey the proper divine authority for tax collection purposes. The statues of gods that stood in the inner sanctums were not merely idols. They were considered the physical body of the god, activated through a ritual called the opening of the mouth, which was believed to allow the deity to see, hear, and eat through the statue, a practice that suggests the Sumerians understood the statue as a vessel or receptacle, not the god itself. A distinction that is subtle but important, implying that the divine could inhabit a manufactured form, a concept that fringe theorists extend to suggest the gods themselves might have been using advanced, perhaps even synthetic or assisted, bodies when interacting with humans, a kind of divine avatar or remote-operated unit, a speculation that turns theology into biomechatronics, a leap that is as creative as it is unsubstantiated, but fun to ponder in the dark, like wondering if the statue ever got a stiff neck from being in one position, a concern for the priests who had to do the ritual chiropractic. The descriptions in texts add another layer. Gods are described as having a terrifying melamu, a radiant aura or splendor that inspires awe and fear, a brilliance that surrounds them, a concept that appears in many ancient cultures, the Hebrew kavod, the Greek charis, and is universally interpreted as a metaphorical description of divine power and majesty. The fringe, naturally, interprets this melamu as a literal physical radiation, perhaps from a power source or energy field surrounding their person or technology, a reading that turns a poetic attribute into a hazardous materials warning, a shift in tone that is both jarring and curiously modern, reflecting our own age of nuclear energy and force fields, a projection of contemporary concerns onto the past that is the engine of much fringe history, and a setup for a health and safety joke. Warning. Divine presence may cause radiant burns, awe, and spontaneous temple construction. Maintain a safe distance of at least 50 cubits and wear appropriate ceremonial shielding. The scholarly consensus on the hybrid creatures, like the Lamashu winged bull with a human head, or the Anzu lion-headed eagle, is that they are apotropaic guardians, symbolic composites of powerful natural forces, strength of bull, sovereignty of human, speed of eagle, meant to ward off evil and protect sacred spaces, their very impossibility making them suitable boundary markers between the human and divine realms. The fringe view often posits they were either genetic experiments gone wrong or right, or mechanical constructs, ancient robots or drones built by the Anunnaki for surveillance or defense, an interpretation fueled by their rigid, symmetrical, and often highly stylized portrayal in art, which can look schematic, like a diagram, a case where artistic convention is mistaken for technical drawing, a common pitfall when viewing ancient art through a modern lens. A lens that is often polished with sci-fi expectations, leading to museum-label fantasies. Exhibit A, Guardian Lamashu, mainstream, symbol of divine protection. Fringe, MK, I biomechanical sentry unit. Please do not feed the exhibit, it may require a ritual reboot. The boat of heaven descriptions are particularly evocative. In texts, the god Nana, the moon, sails his boat through the night sky, and Inanna uses hers to travel to the underworld, vessels described as glowing, shining, and made of precious materials. In art, gods are sometimes shown standing on boat-like platforms with animal heads or surrounded by waves. Mainstream scholarship sees this as a natural metaphor for celestial bodies, sailing the cosmic sea, a poetic extension of their river-based culture to the heavens. The fringe sees detailed accounts of anti-gravity vehicles or shuttle craft, with the waves being stylized representations of cloud banks or energy waves, a translation that turns myth into mission log, a process that can be compelling but often loses the myth's emotional and cultural resonance, trading wonder for wiring diagrams, a trade that not everyone is willing to make, but one that certainly fuels the engines of speculation and jokes about divine travel agents. What's the in-flight meal on the boat of heaven? Ambrosia, naturally, but if you're traveling with Enki, it's freshly caught fish from the Abzu, served with a side of clever plans. One of the most cited pieces of evidence in the fringe canon is the so-called Baghdad Battery, or the Parthian Battery, a clay jar from a much later period Parthian, 250 BCE, 250 CE, containing a copper cylinder and iron rod, which some suggest could have functioned as a primitive galvanic cell. While this is not Sumerian and its actual use is debated, most likely a storage scroll jar or a tool for electroplating, it is often pulled into the discussion to argue that the ancients had electrical knowledge given to them by the gods, a classic example of chronological and cultural conflation that drives historians to distraction, but makes for a great story about ancient power grids, a story that ignores the fact that no wires, bulbs, or switches have ever been found. A logistical hurdle that is hand-waved away with, they used it for sacred purposes only, an explanation as convenient as it is unfalsifiable, and the basis for a tech support joke. Have you tried turning the God King off and on again? Unplug the sacred battery, wait for a count of 7 divine breaths, and then re-invoke the ritual. As you sink deeper into your pillow, try to hold both visions in your mind. The ancient artist, seeking to convey the awe-inspiring, otherworldly nature of the divine through the visual language available to him, using scale, hybridity, and radiance to express what words could not, and the modern literalist, seeking to decode that same art as a technical record of advanced beings. Both are acts of interpretation, born from a desire to understand, to make contact with that otherness, a desire that is the through line of this entire journey, a desire that the Sumerians themselves institutionalized in every seal, every statue, every hymn. Perhaps the truth, as it often is, lies in the space between. The Sumerians were describing a reality as they perceived it, a reality where the divine was immanent, powerful, and interacted with their world in ways that felt tangible. And they used the most advanced concepts they had, kingship, boats, radiance, hybrid animals, to describe that interaction, creating a symbolic system that was, to them, as real as the clay under their feet, a system that we are still deciphering, not because it holds the blueprints for a starship, but because it holds the blueprint for the human encounter with the sacred, a blueprint that is messy, symbolic, and profound, and much funnier than we often give it credit for, as any system that involves dressing statues and worrying about their meal preferences inherently is. The mainstream fact of this artistic canon's longevity and influence is undeniable. Its motifs traveled to Egypt, the Levant, and Greece, influencing the portrayal of deities for millennia, a visual vocabulary of divinity that starts here, in these carved stones and molded clays, a vocabulary that speaks of a hierarchical, ordered cosmos where the gods are present, powerful, and approachable through correct ritual and representation, a worldview that is coherent and deeply satisfying in its completeness, leaving no room for accidental universes or uncaring voids. A comfort that we might even envy, a comfort that comes with its own bureaucratic headaches, as captured in a priestly jest. What's the difference between a god and a high-ranking administrator? The god's inbox is made of celestial fire, and the complaints are about the fabric of reality, not missing sheep. And so, as we near the end of our factual, fringe, and debated journey through the Sumerian cosmos, we have all the pieces laid out before us. The temple, the landing pad; the myth, the instruction manual; the king, the hybrid connector; the stars, the navigation chart; and the iconography, the identification guide. The Sumerians had built a complete, closed-loop system explaining their genesis and facilitating divine arrival. In our final section, we will attempt the synthesis, weaving these threads together to see the tapestry they formed, a tapestry that connects the mud of Eridu to the book of Genesis, and to our own endless fascination with the idea that we are not alone, that we were visited, shaped, and perhaps even loved by beings from beyond the stars, a story that is as old as writing itself, and one that we are, in our own way, still inscribing on the clay tablets of our culture, a story that, for all its debates and jokes, ultimately speaks to a hope that there is more, that we are part of a larger story, a hope that is the best possible reason to drift off to sleep, with the stars outside your window perhaps feeling just a little closer and a little more full of stories than they did before we began. And so we arrive at the loom, where all the threads we have gathered, the temple mud, the scribe's tale, the king's ritual, the astronomer's chart, and the artist's image, are finally woven together into the tapestry that is the Sumerian vision of existence, a vision so coherent and compelling that its patterns would be copied, adapted, and rewoven into the foundational texts of Western civilization, most notably the book of Genesis. And it is here, in this act of cultural transmission and transformation, that we find our final mainstream, undeniable fact: the profound and demonstrable literary and thematic parallels between Sumerian mythology and the early chapters of Genesis, a connection not of plagiarism, but of shared Mesopotamian cultural heritage, where the Hebrews, during their Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, encountered these ancient stories and refashioned them through the lens of their own monotheistic theology, producing a narrative that is both familiar and radically different. Imagine a Judean scribe, sitting not in a reed marsh but perhaps in a courtyard in Babylon, the great ziggurat of Etemenenki towering in the distance, a constant visual reminder of a different cosmology, and he is tasked with writing down the origin stories of his people, drawing from oral traditions that themselves had roots in the wider Canaanite and Mesopotamian world. And as he writes of a garden, a flood, and a creation from dust, he is unconsciously, or perhaps consciously, engaging in a dialogue with the stories pressed into the clay all around him, stories that were the common intellectual property of the ancient Near East, but which he filters through a revolutionary idea. There is only one God, a God of covenant and moral law, not a squabbling pantheon motivated by labor disputes and noise complaints, a theological simplification that is as dramatic as it is enduring, and a process that would have involved a lot of editorial decisions like, okay, the bit with the many gods complaining about work, that's out. The clever God helping humanity subvert the chief God's plans. Nope. The giant circular boat. Let's make it a rectangular arc. It's more stable for the animals, and also we're making a theological point about obedience. And the sacred marriage ritual. Absolutely not. We're going with a subtle metaphor about relationship, and no one gets dressed up as a deity. It's confusing. The quirky, fringe interpretation of this connection, however, takes a different, more direct route. It posits that the Hebrews didn't just adapt stories. They preserved a purer, less corrupted version of the original truth, that the God of Genesis, the Elohim, a plural word, is in fact the same Anunnaki council, but with the Hebrews choosing to worship one particular member of that council, Yahweh, who may have been Enlil or a similar deity, and that the Genesis stories are therefore not myth but a veiled historical record of the same events described in Sumerian texts, from creation to flood, filtered through a monotheistic reform movement that sought to consolidate power under one supreme commander of the alien expeditionary force. A theory that attempts to harmonize two different myth systems by making them both literally true accounts of the same extraterrestrial events, a neat trick that satisfies a desire for a unified field theory of ancient religion, but which requires a lot of selective reading and theological gymnastics, and leads to jokes about divine rebranding. What did Yahweh say to the Anunnaki board? I'm going solo, taking the Abraham account with me. You guys can keep the Mesopotamian franchise, but the intellectual property on the flood story is still under negotiation. The scholarly debate on this connection is vast and mature, focusing on the mechanisms of transmission, oral, written during the exile, the nature of the adaptations, what was changed and why, and the theological implications of seeing the Bible as part of a wider ancient Near Eastern conversation rather than a unique revelation, a debate that once caused scandal but is now standard in academic biblical studies, though it can still raise eyebrows in certain circles. A reminder that how we read these texts is often a reflection of our own beliefs and biases, a meta-debate that is itself a fascinating layer atop the ancient ones, and a source of dry, academic humor. What's the difference between a Sumerian myth and a biblical story? About 500 years, a mountain of theological interpretation, and several dozen scholarly careers built on comparing them. The parallels are striking when laid side by side. The Sumerian concept of a watery chaos, Namu/Tiamat, mirrored in Genesis's deep Tehem. The creation of humans from clay mixed with divine essence Atrahasis, echoed in Adam formed from dust of the ground and God's breath. The garden of the gods Dilmun reflected in Eden, the tree of life appearing in both. The flood sent by angry gods, a god with a righteous survivor, Atrahasis/Noah, warned to build a boat. The offering after the flood that pleases the deity. Even the idea of humans becoming like gods, knowing good and evil, finds a parallel in the Atrahasis epic where humans have the flesh of the god, intelligence. These are not random coincidences. They are the shared furniture of the Mesopotamian mythological landscape, repurposed for a new theological vision. A vision that stripped the stories of their polytheistic polyphony to tell a singular story about monotheistic morality and human responsibility, a shift from "why are we here?" to "do the God's work" to "how should we live?" in obedient relationship to the one God, a profound transformation of the narrative's purpose and the subject of a scribe's lament. Rewriting the creation story for the one God model is easy. It's cutting out all the juicy divine committee meetings that hurts the narrative flow. The fringe theories attempt to literalize both traditions into a single historical narrative runs into the obvious problem of contradiction. In Sumerian myth, multiple gods create humans as slaves. In Genesis, one god creates humans as the pinnacle of creation, in his image. In Sumerian myth, the flood is sent because humans are too noisy. In Genesis, it's because of human wickedness. In Sumerian myth, humanity is saved by a trickster god subverting the chief god. In Genesis, it's because Noah found favor with the one God. These are not minor details. They are foundational differences in theology and worldview. The fringe reconciles this by suggesting the Hebrews were followers of a specific Anunnaki faction, pro-human, perhaps Enki's group, and their texts reflect that faction's propaganda, a complex conspiracy theory that requires the ancient Hebrews to be aware of and intentionally editing an interstellar political struggle, a layer of complexity that the texts themselves show no awareness of, being far more concerned with covenant, law, and land. A disconnect that is hand-waved away with its encoded, the ultimate refuge of a theory in trouble, and a setup for a decoder joke. What's the secret message in Genesis 1:1? According to fringe theory, it's Enki was right, but you have to read it backwards in Akkadian during a solar eclipse while wearing a tinfoil hat for it to be clear. The enduring power of the Sumerian connection to Genesis lies not in proving one right or the other, but in demonstrating the deep human need for origin stories, for explaining our place in the cosmos, a need that transcends culture and time, and that finds expression in the materials and ideas at hand. For the Sumerians, it was the mud of the river and the politics of the temple. For the Hebrews, it was the dust of the desert and the law of the covenant, both profound responses to the same existential questions, and both, in their own way, attempts to connect the human to the divine, to find a bridge between the earthly and the heavenly, whether that bridge was a ziggurat, a king, or a moral law, a pursuit that is, at its heart, deeply moving and often deeply funny in its earnestness, as any grand project undertaken by finite beings tends to be. So what have we learned on this long, meandering journey down the twin rivers? We've learned that the Sumerians, with their brilliant, practical minds, built a complete system for understanding their world, a system that linked their genesis to the arrival of gods through architecture, ritual, kingship, astronomy, and art, a system that was so persuasive it shaped the thought of their neighbors for centuries. We've seen how their stories, stripped of their polytheistic particulars, provided the raw narrative material for one of the world's most influential books. And we've entertained the possibility, however slim, that at the core of all this myth and symbol lies a kernel of memory so strange it involves visitors from another world, a possibility that says more about our own desires and anxieties than it does about the Sumerians, but a possibility that is, in its own way, a tribute to the power of their imagination, an imagination that could look at a pile of mud bricks and see a stairway to heaven, and look at the stars and see the boats of their makers. As you drift now toward sleep, let the threads intertwine in your mind. The cool clay of the tablet, the heat of the ritual lamp, the weight of the horned crown, the chill of the observatory roof, the gleam of the carved seal, and the sound of a scribe's stylus in in Babylon and Jerusalem, scratching out versions of the same great story. We are the heirs of that story, whether we view it as sacred history, profound myth, or ancient astronaut theory. We are still asking the Sumerian questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? And we are still using the tools of our time, science, philosophy, religion, art, to build our own ziggurats of understanding, our own bridges between the known and the unknown. That project, that endless, glorious, frustrating, and humorous project, is the true connection, the thread that runs unbroken from the marshlands of ancient Sumer to the quiet of your room tonight. The fan hums, the night is deep. And the stars, those ancient beacons, still shine, silent and watchful as ever. Whether they are the eyes of gods, the lights of distant suns, or simply beautiful points of cold fire, they continue to inspire stories, and that perhaps is the most wonderful connection of all. So take this tapestry of ideas, this blend of fact, fringe, and debate, woven with jokes and gentle sarcasm, and let it be your blanket tonight. A heavy, textured, and comforting weight of history and mystery, as you close your eyes and let the current of sleep carry you away, back down the rivers of time, or forward into dreams of celestial boats and gardens at the dawn of the world, wherever your own imagination chooses to wander, knowing that you have participated in the oldest human ritual of all, the telling of stories to make sense of the night. End of script, sweet dreams.